The receptionist nearly filed the application without a second glance. It was another gray Thursday, another line of hopeful faces stretching toward the doors of one of the largest logistics firms on the Pacific Northwest coast. But when the form landed on the executive floor 2 hours later, the billionaire CEO froze in the middle of reviewing a shipping contract. She read one line over and over until her assistant leaned in and quietly asked whether something was wrong. It wasn't the applicant's experience. It wasn't his home address. It was his name. If you believe in kindness and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner 2.0. The early frost still clung to the windows of Cedar Landing when Silas Marsh eased his rusting station wagon into a spot outside a hardware store. The car groaned each time he cut the engine, but it hauled him faithfully through 11 long winters. He turned toward the back seat, where his 9-year-old daughter, Della, was finishing the crust of a jam sandwich while flipping through a library book about lighthouses. "You'll miss the bell," Silas said gently. "One more paragraph. You said that 3 paragraphs ago." Della grinned, folded the corner of the page, and slid out of the car. Her backpack looked nearly as tired as the wagon. Silas had sewn the bottom, seemed shut himself after it split open the previous autumn. They walked side by side toward the school gate. "How's the ankle?" Silas asked. "Fine." "You sure?" Della nodded. Children streamed past while parents rushed off toward their mornings. Silas waited until he watched her vanish through the double doors. Only then did he walk back to the car. His own workday no longer existed. A month earlier, the warehouse where he had spent close to 14 years had lost its anchor client. Within a week, 2/3 of the floor staff were let go. Silas had emptied his locker into a milk crate, shaken hands with men he'd sweated beside for years, and driven home wondering how many weeks his small savings could stretch. The answer arrived sooner than he wanted. Rent, the electric bill, Della's winter coat, his mother's prescription costs. It all came due at once. For the first stretch, he told himself another warehouse job would surface fast. It didn't. Every interview closed the same way. "We'll hold on to your application." Nobody ever rang back. That Thursday, he decided pride could wait until the bills were paid. Any honest work counted as good work, which was how he ended up driving toward Meridian Freight, a premier shipping and storage company known for running ports, distribution hubs, and cold storage facilities all along the coast. Their site had posted an opening. Custodial staff, full-time, benefits after 90 days. In his years on the floor, he had rebuilt conveyor motors, wired control panels, patched loading docks, led crews, and kept facilities the size of airfields running through every season. Now he was applying to sweep corridors. A guard pointed the applicants toward a sleek glass tower overlooking the shipping channel. Everything about it gleamed. Staff crossed the polished lobby carrying coffee in metal tumblers, chatting between meetings. Silas grew suddenly conscious of the frayed cuffs on his gray canvas coat. He almost walked back out. Instead, he drew a slow breath and stepped forward. The receptionist pushed a clipboard across the desk without much curiosity. "Application?" "Yes, ma'am." "Fill it out." He took a seat beside 3 other applicants. One looked fresh out of school. Another wore boots that still had the store shine on them. Silas nodded politely and kept his eyes on the form. The questions were the usual sort. Past employers, emergency contacts, schooling, references. Then came the line asking for his full legal name. He wrote it out carefully. Silas Andrew Marsh. His hand stayed steady despite everything pressing on it. When he finished, he returned the clipboard. "It may take a few days," the receptionist said. "That's fine." As he reached the doors, another staff member hurried after him. "Sir." Silas turned. "The facilities director is meeting with applicants briefly today. If you have the time." He nearly laughed at how much time he had. "I've got plenty." The waiting area outside the facilities office looked out over the channel. Cargo ships crawled across the water while cranes swung slowly against the pale sky. Silas watched them for close to 20 minutes. The director finally emerged, a broad-shouldered man named Grant Ashby with a pen tucked behind one ear. They shook hands. Grant scanned the application. "You've done far more than custodial work." "I have. So why apply for this?" Silas answered plainly. I need steady work. Grant nodded like he'd heard the same words many times. We value honesty around here. The interview ran under 15 minutes. Shifts, equipment, safety codes, night work. Nothing unusual. As Silas rose to leave, Grant offered a small smile. You're overqualified. I've heard that. You understand this isn't running a maintenance department. I understand. Grant shook his hand again. We'll be deciding soon. Silas thanked him and headed for the lot. By noon, he was already filling out another application across the city. Life didn't stop just because hope felt thin. On the top floor of Meridian Freight, CEO Elena Vance was trying to finish a port expansion proposal before her afternoon board meeting. Her office faced the open sea. Guests often admired the sculptures or the wall of glass. Elena barely registered them anymore. She registered forecasts, deadlines, customs delays, insurance disputes. The company employed nearly 14,000 people across 5 states. Every choice carried weight. Her assistant came in balancing a stack of folders. Human resources needs signatures. Elena reached for her pen out of habit. One folder held executive recommendations. Another covered apprenticeship approvals. Then came routine hiring paperwork that needed her signature because the company had recently launched a second chance employment program. Most names slid beneath her eyes in seconds, until one didn't. Her pen stopped. She read it again. Silas Andrew Marsh. The room went oddly still. Her assistant frowned. Everything all right? Elena didn't answer at first. She stared out the window toward the channel, where the sun was finally cutting through the frost-gray sky. The name had not touched her desk in nearly 19 years. It can't be, she murmured, almost to herself. The assistant looked puzzled. Do you know him? I knew someone with that name. Not just someone. A snowstorm, a broken-down truck, a tiny diner off the interstate, a debt she had never managed to repay. Memories she'd tucked away beneath 2 decades of meetings surfaced with uncomfortable sharpness. She closed the folder. Can you ask HR to hold this application for now? Is there a problem? No. She looked down once more. I just want to meet the applicant myself. The assistant blinked. For a custodial role? Elena gave the smallest nod. Personally. Far below, Silas drove home with no idea that one line written in steady handwriting had interrupted the busiest day of one of the wealthiest women on the coast. He assumed his form would sink into another pile of paperwork, exactly like all the others. He had no reason to think otherwise. At home, he found Della on the apartment stairs beside an older neighbor, helping her sort a spilled box of buttons back into their tin. Silas smiled to himself before carrying the groceries inside. The red overdue notice was still fixed to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sailboat. He studied it for a long moment, then opened the cabinet and started dinner. Outside, the evening wind carried the low horns of ships returning to port. Somewhere across the city, Elena Vance was lifting the lid off an old tin she hadn't opened in years, searching for something tied to a name she thought she'd never see again. Elena found the dented tin on the top shelf of a cabinet in the corner of her office. It had followed her through 3 headquarters, 2 homes, and more years than she cared to count. She wiped away a film of dust before prying it open. Inside sat ordinary things that would have meant nothing to anyone else. A creased diner napkin, a folded road atlas with a torn spine, a cheap brass keyring shaped like a wrench. And beneath them, tucked in an envelope, was a handwritten receipt. Marche son roadside repair. The pencil had faded, but the name was still legible. She sank back into her chair. 19 years earlier, she hadn't been a billionaire. She'd been 27, fighting to keep a failing freight startup breathing after her lead backer pulled out. Her secondhand truck had died in a blizzard while she raced toward the one client meeting that could have saved everything. A repair shop had been shutting its doors for the night. A man named Andrew Marsh had reopened the bay after spotting her stranded on the shoulder. She remembered apologizing because she couldn't cover the full bill until the next week. Andrew had only smiled. Get to your meeting, he'd said. Pay me when things settle down. Things never settled down. Within a few months, her company unexpectedly surged after landing a chain of port contracts. She meant to go back, but by the time she drove out, the shop had already closed. A neighbor said the owner had fallen ill and the family had moved on. She mailed a check to the old address. It came back unopened. Eventually, the work swallowed the memory whole. Now, looking at the application on her desk, she noticed the emergency contact beneath Silas's name. Andrew Marsh. The same name. She pressed the intercom. "Could you schedule Mr. Marsh for tomorrow morning?" A pause. "I'd just like to speak with him." Silas almost let the call go the next morning because the number was unfamiliar. "This is Silas." "Good morning, Mr. Marsh. This is Human Resources at Meridian Freight. The CEO would like to meet with you today, if you're available." He frowned. "I'm sorry, the CEO?" "Yes. There must be a mix-up." "There isn't." He looked around his apartment, as if the walls might explain what was happening. "What time?" 10 o'clock. "I'll be there." After he hung up, he stood quietly in the kitchen. Della glanced up from her cereal bowl. "Good news?" "I honestly don't know." The executive floor felt even quieter than Silas remembered. Thick carpet swallowed every step. Glass walls threw back the bright morning light off the water. An assistant greeted him kindly. "Ms. Vance will see you now." Silas stepped inside. The office was larger than his whole apartment, but the woman behind the desk didn't strike him as intimidating. She stood rather than staying seated and studied him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You must be Silas Marsh." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for coming." She gestured toward a chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she asked, "Your father, is his name Andrew?" Silas nodded slowly. "It is." Elena looked down briefly, then smiled, though something sad sat behind it. "I hope that wasn't wrong." Silas searched his memory. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" "No." She folded her hands. "But your father helped me once, long before either of us imagined ending up here." She told him the story. Not dramatically, not in a rush, just as she remembered it. When she finished, Silas smiled faintly. "That sounds like him. Is he well?" "He has lung trouble now. Good days and bad ones." "I'm sorry to hear it. He still sharpens the neighbor's garden tools, even though I keep telling him to rest." For the first time, they both laughed. It loosened something in the room. Elena reached into a drawer and set the faded receipt on the desk. "I've carried this for years." Silas stared at it. "I haven't seen our old shop stamp since I was a kid. I owed your father far more than what's written here." "You don't owe us anything." "I think I do." He shook his head gently. "My dad never helped people expecting anything back." Those words lingered longer than either of them expected. Elena understood something in that moment. If she handed Silas a job to settle an old debt, she'd be turning his father's kindness into a transaction. That wasn't what Andrew Marsh had stood for. She slid the receipt back into its envelope. "I won't insult either of you by pretending sentiment should replace qualifications." Silas appreciated the honesty. She went on. "I read through your work history myself." He looked surprised. "You've supervised repair crews, trained new hires, and run mechanical systems across full facilities. Why apply for custodial work?" "Because that's where the opening was." "And because you needed work?" "Yes." She nodded. "I respect that answer." Rather than ending the meeting there, Elena called in the facilities director and the operations lead. The next hour turned into something Silas hadn't anticipated. They talked about conveyor systems, preventive maintenance, energy costs, training younger staff, safety audits. Silas answered easily, because it was the work he'd spent most of his life doing. At one point, the operations lead leaned back and grinned. "We've been chasing the refrigeration fault for months." Silas shrugged. "Sounds like it needs a revised defrost cycle, not a new compressor." The man started scribbling notes. Elena watched in silence. She wasn't seeing a custodial applicant anymore. She was seeing a man who had nearly stopped believing in his own skill because unemployment had shoved him toward whatever job might keep food on the table. When the meeting ended, she stood. "I don't think the custodial role is the right fit." Silas managed a polite smile. "I understand. I wasn't finished." She handed him another folder. "We have an opening for Assistant Regional Facilities Supervisor. It pays considerably more, includes benefits immediately, and calls for exactly the experience you've spent years building." He looked at the folder without opening it. "I didn't apply for this." "No, you don't even know if I'd be any good at it. I know enough to offer you an interview." She smiled. The interview was the last hour. For a few seconds, Silas simply sat there. Not because he was overwhelmed, but because after weeks of rejection, it felt strange to have someone notice what he could do instead of the title he'd written on a form. Finally, he asked, "Are you offering this because of my father?" Elena answered carefully. "I'm offering it because you're qualified." She paused. "And because your father reminded me, years ago, to see the person in front of me before judging the situation around them." That answer mattered. It let Silas accept without feeling that charity had replaced dignity. Several weeks later, Della visited the headquarters on an employee family day. She wandered through the maintenance shop wearing safety goggles far too big for her face, while Silas introduced her to technicians across the building. Near the end of the afternoon, Elena happened to pass by. Della thanked her politely for hiring her dad. Elena smiled. "I think your dad earned that himself." Then the girl reached into her backpack. "I made something." It was a simple drawing. A little repair shop. A tall office tower. Two people shaking hands in the space between them. Above the picture, in wobbly letters, she had written, "Kindness travels farther than we think." Elena asked if she could keep it. "It's yours." She framed it a week later and set on a bookshelf rather than behind her desk. Visitors sometimes asked about the child's drawing. She always gave the same answer. "It reminds me not to overlook ordinary people." Months went by. Silas settled naturally into the new role. He wasn't flawless. He occasionally misread a schedule, forgot minor details, and once ordered the wrong seals for 2 loading bays. Instead of hiding it, he owned the mistake at once and fixed it alongside his crew. The people under him respected that. His father slowly regained enough strength to visit one of the company's facilities. He insisted on bringing a tin of homemade ginger cookies for the maintenance team because, as he liked to say, people work better with a good cookie in them. Nobody argued. One quiet afternoon, Elena met Andrew in person. He had no idea who she was until she mentioned the snowstorm all those years ago. He smiled with the same calm kindness she remembered. "I figured things worked out for you." "They did." "Glad to hear it." There was no speech. No dramatic reunion. Just 2 people sharing coffee while workers repaved the walkway outside. It felt complete. Before he left, Andrew looked towards Silas talking with his crew. "You know," he said softly, "he almost didn't apply here." "I'm glad he did." "So am I." Sometimes life doesn't reward kindness right away. Sometimes it circles back years later in a shape no one expects. Not as repayment, but as a chance to notice someone who might otherwise be overlooked. Comment kindness still exists if you believe even one good act can change a life. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share with someone who still believes kindness matters. The best opportunities often begin when someone chooses to look past a job title, a worn coat, or a hard season. Kindness doesn't erase hardship, but can remind people of their worth. And sometimes that's exactly where a better future begins.